Okay, I think we're good to go ahead and start. So hello everyone, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Planning for Your Microsoft Dynamics GP Year End. We appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to join us. There's just a couple of housekeeping items that we'd like to mention before we begin the presentation. All attendees are in listen-only mode. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please either raise your hand so that we can unmute you or submit them through the GoToWebinar question box. We'll be answering questions throughout the presentation, and we'll also follow up after the presentation to answer any additional questions. Today I'd like to introduce our speaker. We have Jeff Smith, a Senior Client Success Manager at Socius. So at this point, Jeff, I think you can go ahead and transition the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who's on the line. It's that time of year where we're going to go over that topic we only have to think about right about this time of year. So what I wanted to first start off with is just what is our agenda. First of all, our goals for this presentation are really to review the common year-end processes and provide tips and tricks for preparing for year-end. What you're going to find during this process is when we review the year-end checklist that it's more about preparation than it really is about the task itself, because the task is really typically fairly simple. But we are going to walk through all of this. I will tell you that I am going to be completely in PowerPoint today, but I think that is really more for continuity than anything else. I have included screenshots of all of the different windows that you'll have to pay attention to for your year-end process, and I have also included a path to get to those screens. So you'll see what I mean here in just a minute. So first of all, I wanted to start off, and I've done this presentation for several years now, and I always use the same recommendations. And the biggest one is to make sure that when you're getting to the year-end process, use your resources. So what are those resources? Well, there are many, and we'll talk about those. So first of all, many of you may already have access to what's called Customer Source, which is Microsoft's customer portal that allows you to find out what's new with GP. It has a tech knowledge for support cases, and it also has a number of the checklists that we're going to cover today. And I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. You also obviously always have access to the Dynamics GP Solution Support Team. And more practically, we also want to make sure that you're working with us in case you have any questions, either on preparation or the actual completion of the year-end process. Second recommendation is really just be prepared. And really the biggest thing is make sure that all of your day-to-day activities are completed. But I would add one more thing, is make sure that you have either this presentation deck, which you'll have access to, or the checklist off of Customer Source, just so you're organized and ready to go, so that when you do get to that point, you know all the steps you need to complete. The other thing is really be methodical. Take your time, review and follow the year-end checklist as closely as possible. Verify any ISV compatibility, and you'll probably get tired of me saying this by the time we get done, but make sure you make backups as you go through this process. We want to make sure that this is a smooth and simple process, and if anything does happen, you have an escape route to get back to where you were. Also, I wanted to point out some other resources that are available to you. I would bet that some of you that are on this call may have attended or are part of the GPUG group, which is the GP user group, and you have access to information at gpug.com. A couple other websites that are out there that have a lot of good information, not only about year-end processing, but about GP in general, are gpwindow.com, victoriaanduden.com, and dynamicaccount.com. There are some folks that have been working with Dynamics GP for many, many years. They have a lot of good information to share with you about a variety of topics, but obviously this is a very important one when you get to the end of the year, and you should be able to find information there if you have questions as well. So as you can see, there's a variety of different ways that you can get the information you need. And this is probably just the beginning of that. So one of the things I talked about was knowledge base, which is a part of customer source. And the reason I pointed that out is that each knowledge base article has a case number. And you'll notice that there are 6 modules listed here, and they each have a number that is associated with them. So if you do use customer source and you do use the knowledge base, you can actually search for year end, or you can just use the case number, and that'll get you directly to the individual checklist, which you then have the ability to print or to at least leverage as part of your process. So there are 6 modules that actually have formal year-end processes: inventory control, receivables management, payables management, fixed asset management, and general ledger. I'm gonna backtrack a little bit. Analytical accounting does not have a formal process, but there is a knowledge base article that kind of talks to that. And so as we go through this, you'll see what I mean. All right. So just some common things that you need to take care of when you're going through your year-end process is make sure that you finalize all applicable transactions. And I'm going to say that several times as we go through here and give you specific examples as we go through. Also, reconciling any of the sub-modules to the general ledger just to make sure that you're organized and in sync before you go through the process. Print any necessary reports or files, and then make a backup when you're finished. So we'll probably label that something like pre-year-end backup. And then you can obviously begin the closing process. So we're going to talk about making sure that you do backups before any of these year-end processes are completed. We'll also talk about some of the complexity to some of them and the ease of some of them as we go through as well. All right. So I told you that I would include some screenshots so that you know exactly where everything is. And this is a common screen that is used for many of the modules throughout GP, in which case you set up the fiscal periods and the years. So you can see here that I have 2017 set up, the first and last day, and the number of periods, and the system then allows me to create my year. You're going to notice across the columns that I have each of the different series of modules. And by the way, we covered payroll in its own presentation yesterday. So if you were hoping to see something about payroll, we won't be covering that today, but we do have a recording of that presentation, as well as you'll be able to get a copy of the slide presentation as well. But this is the screen that allows you to set up the individual periods in your year and then the year, and of course the year itself. It also allows you to close individual periods, which we will refer to as we go through many of the year-end checklists. So now we're going to get into what order for which we would close the modules. And I understand that you may or may not have this entire list of modules, so just keep that in mind. Some of you may not do sales orders or purchase orders. You may not maintain inventory. And so we're going through the entire list, but I just wanted to make sure that if you have them all, this is the order for which you should attempt to close. So you'll notice that you got sales orders and purchase orders, you got inventory, receivables, payables, fixed assets, like I mentioned earlier, analytical accounting, and then the general ledger. So first thing I want to start off with is just the sales order and purchase order, and I'm going to lump those together. So first of all, for sales order and purchase order, there are really no specific close processes in either module. So there isn't going to be a utility window or a routine window that you go to in sales order processing that says close year. However, as you probably are aware if you're using sales order processing, it interfaces directly with the receivables module. And therefore, to get an accurate close, you want to make sure that you double check for any applicable invoices or returns and make sure that those are posted so that they flow through into your receivables module, because it does have a formal closing process and those numbers will be included. On the purchase order side, you got to think about the very same thing, only this time it's really, you need to double check for any applicable receivings or receivers and invoice matches as you go through the typical procurement process. So from the purchase order, we then will receive against the purchase order, and then we'll match invoices against the receipt and the PO. We want to make sure those get posted because those invoices will then flow into your accounts payable module so that you have accurate numbers there. So a lot of times this ends up being a timing thing so that you make sure that all of your either receivables, invoices, and returns and credits are all posted, and the same be true on the payable side. And then one other thing I wanted to mention about the purchase order module is that there is a report that exists inside of the purchase order module that is called Received Not Invoiced Report. And that report actually allows you to tie out your accrued purchases liability account. So as you're considering your year-end process, it's probably a good idea once everything has been posted that you print that report. And to get to that report, you simply would select purchasing down in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. You can then select on the purchasing area page, you can select reports, you can select analysis, and then you can select received not invoiced. So that is the path that you'll follow to get to that particular report, and you can print that out as part of your year-end process. So I'm going to tie purchasing to the inventory module as well, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. I wanted to make sure that we kind of kept common modules together, and so I think this is going to be probably something that you'll want to pay attention to. The other thing I didn't mention with sales orders and purchase orders is that those sales orders and purchase orders can also affect your inventory. So when I post an invoice through sales order processing, not only does it update accounts receivable, but it also will decrement your inventory or increase it if it's a return. On the purchase order side, obviously, those receivers that you get would update your inventory as well, and therefore affect your year-end numbers and inventory. Okay, so then we're going to go ahead and move on to talk about inventory. And so inventory is a module that should be closed at the end of your fiscal year, and you should close it before any transactions that would affect inventory quantities are posted. Now, sometimes that's difficult, but it is something that you should certainly try to get done. And oftentimes, this is really not a year-end process that is very time-consuming. So it may be something that you'll have the capability of fitting in even when you're busy. So what does that year-end process do? Well, it does several things. First of all, it transfers all of your summarized current year quantity, cost, and sales to last year. And the system, so one thing let me finish that sentence, and then basically I'll kind of explain that a little bit. For items for which you have been keeping summarized sales history. Everywhere in GP, in most modules in GP, you're going to have transaction details, and then you're going to have summary windows by period. And so what this really allows us to do is take our current year quantities that we've sold, our costs that we've accumulated, the sales that we've accumulated, and close those out so that you can start fresh with your new year. And there are places where those summary numbers will come into play in areas such as Smart List. So if you want to track the quantity sold or cost or sales, that's what happens. And that's why it's important to be able to have good timing in regards to making sure that close. The other thing that's important is it updates each item's beginning quantity from the quantity on hand at each site. So therefore, you also have run into the issue of quantity activity during the year, and timing becomes very important. The other thing that it'll do is it zeroes out the quantity sold field in the item quantities maintenance. So if you go into inventory and you go to cards and quantities and sites, this basically will zero out your quantity sold. So every time I run a sales order invoice through the system, it will increase the quantity I've sold, unless it's a return, in which case it will decrement that number. So it really, if you think about it, is really just cleaning up so that your summary numbers for the move forward and for some of your inquiries are accurate. There are some additional options, and I'll show you this window in just a moment. There are some additional options in regards to things that you can do. For instance, the system has the ability at the end of the year to have an option to remove discontinued items. You also have the ability to remove all your sold receipts. And therefore, items that you've received but you've also sold can be moved out. You can remove sold lot attributes, so if you have lot tracked items, and also cost change history. So those can be removed. And then also, if you're valuing your inventory using standard cost, then it can actually update your standard cost to the current cost. So all of those are options when you go to the year-end close process. So then, and I know there's a lot to go through here, but I just wanted to talk about the checklist, and then I'm going to show you the screen that's accompanying this. And then I'll take a quick break to ask if there's any questions. So in inventory, what you do is post all of your transactions for the year. Also, you can reconcile your inventory quantities. GP has a reconcile tool that really the idea, and there's one in Professional Service Tools library as well, but either one of those, the purpose of those is to make sure that your summary numbers are equal to your transaction detail. And so when you do that, then it'll move the accurate amounts over to the next bucket. And this is, for many organizations, they may do an annual fiscal inventory, so typically that's at the end of their fiscal year, and so you'll do a physical inventory count and then post any adjustments to that. So you want to make sure that's done prior to you running your year end. Print any other additional reports that you may use on some frequency, and then you're going to make a backup. So the key is that you want to have the system as clean and ready as possible. You want to make a backup before you actually jump into the year-end process, and then at that point you can close the year. And also then you can close the fiscal periods for the inventory series. So you may remember that window I showed you with the columns with all of the different modules. This would allow you to close the fiscal periods for the inventory series for last year. And then you can make a final backup. So this is a pretty complete list that you want to follow to actually close your year in inventory. And as you saw there, really, like I said earlier, it really is focused mostly on preparation, because right here is the only window you have to go to do a year-end close. These are the options that I just mentioned of removing discontinued items, sold lot attributes, sold receipts, and cost change history, and then updating the standard cost. And once I get to this window, I simply need to click process, and it will follow the task that we had just talked about, taking our summary numbers to 0 for the new year, moving that year to the last year, and making sure the system's ready to move forward. So with that, I guess I wanted to just take a moment, and Rebecca, just to see if anybody's posted any questions at this point.
Nope, nothing yet.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so the next module that we want to talk about is Receivables Management. And as you probably recall I talked about sales order processing and what you need to do there, and obviously the trickle-down effect that it has on inventory and receivables. So now we're going to focus very specifically on what we need to do in the receivables module. Now, not every one of you uses sales order processing, but you may have some of you that use receivables without sales order processing. You may integrate billing data from another solution, or you just may enter your receivables transactions after the fact into GP. Now, this is one of a couple modules that actually provides you the ability to have two different year-end closes. So if I were to predict, there's a good number of you on the line, many of you probably work on a calendar year as your fiscal year, and therefore you honestly have the ability to pay attention to both calendar and fiscal at the same time. But they do serve two different purposes. The calendar year-end close is really focused on, well, first of all, it needs to be done at the end of the calendar year prior to posting any transactions in the next calendar year. The fiscal year end close should be done at the end of your fiscal year, so that prior to posting any transactions. And that sounds fairly obvious, I suppose, but there's a reason for it. So what happens is that the fiscal year close transfers all the amounts other than finance charges to the last year column in customer summary, and I'll show you that screen in just a moment, using the amount since last closed view. And you can get to that view by sales, cards, and summary. The calendar year is what handles the year-to-date finance charges. So if any of you out there actually assess finance charges to your clients, this is meant to handle just that process. And really, it's about being able to assess finance charges and have those print on your statements. Now, if any of you have ever had a problem where the amounts that you have in your amount since last close view don't match, if they're incorrect, then Microsoft does have scripts that are available that can correct the amounts. And typically, when would that happen? That typically would happen if a posting was interrupted and the summary numbers didn't get updated properly from the transactions that were posted through the system. So these scripts do allow you to run to make sure that it goes out, it views all of the transactions for the year and updates those numbers for you automatically. Okay, so, and if you need those, you just need to talk to your associate's representative. All right, so now what we do with receivables is we post all sales, like sales order processing, and receivables transactions for the year. So that includes sales invoices, credits, returns. It also includes cash receipts. So all of those transactions should be posted prior to you running your year end. So the next step is then making a pre-year-end closing backup, and then you can run, you can actually close your years. And again, then you can close the fiscal periods. This is optional, and it's optional for all of these. You don't have to do this, but it certainly is something that you have the ability to do. At the end, after receivables and payables, you also can close your tax year, which we'll go back to in just a little bit. Once you've done all this, you've closed your fiscal year, you've closed your tax year, then you have the ability to make a year, you should make a post-year-end closing backup as reference, and then you can move forward with your new year. So notice that there's really recommendations for two backups. One is prior to running your year-end. The second one is before you move forward with your new activity. So what I wanted to show you is, and I really wanted to talk about kind of what's called date sensitivity that GP has. Many of you may be aware of this customer summary window, and this window is meant to provide you with a variety of pieces of information, but it's really meant to kind of show you, hey, here's the activity that has gone on with this particular customer. So you can see their aging buckets, any unposted transactions. Also down here, you're going to notice the year-to-date information, last year information, and life-to-date information. So what happens here with when you close your year is this year-to-date information moves over to the last year. And anything in last year will then move over into the life-to-date year. And in reality, this is GP life-to-date. So this is based on the amount since last close, and that's why this actually is fairly important. And I'm going to show you a screen where it's more important than others. This drop-down window here also gives you the option of fiscal or calendar year. And again, if you're on a calendar year, they're one and the same. But the idea there is that there is date sensitivity, but there's one place where there's not, and I'll show you that in just a second. So really, these are the summary windows that I've been talking about. This is where that data will move from year to date to last year to life to date as you go through the process. Also then on the calendar year, here's where the year to date finance charges are. So you can see current year, last year, next year, and by customer. And so this information follows the same rule. When you do your calendar year and close, this information moves from year to date to last year to life to date. Now, I'll show you one other, I'm going to show you a smart list in a minute that'll kind of talk to that date sensitivity issue that I was mentioning. But for now, I really wanted to share with you, this is the year-end close window. And notice that you get to that window by sales, routines, and year-end close. And because there are two different year-ends that are available in the on the receivables side, you have options to either close all fiscal or calendar year. And so if you're on a calendar year, then you can do them both at the same time. If you're on a fiscal year, you can do that fiscal year. So many of our clients might be on a July 1 to June 30 year as an example. And so they might have a separate fiscal year from calendar year. Now, one good indicator that's here is that the fiscal year, this will tell you the last time you've closed those. So it keeps track. So if you're late in closing, it's going to know it, and you'll know it by looking at the last time that you closed. The other thing that you can do is you can print a report as part of this process. So in reality, the preparation is the key, because really, when you want to close your year, you simply pick this right option for you and click process. And I will tell you, because it's really just zeroing out summary numbers and moving them, it typically is a fairly quick process. Even if you have a lot of data, you shouldn't expect that this is going to take that long. And then the date sensitivity issue is what I wanted to bring up next. So you're going to notice I have a smart list, and this is really an out-of-the-box smart list, except for one thing that I changed. So this is under, in Smart List, it's under Customer, and the typical out-of-the-box view has the customer number, name, address, city, state, zip, and phone. I chose then to include the total sales year to date. This number is really dependent upon you closing your year. So if I'm 2 weeks late, or if I'm 2 months late, or if I've never closed my year, then this number is going to be inaccurate. Now, once I close my year, that script I was telling you about from Microsoft will help correct those numbers for you. But the way GP works and the way this smart list works, and this is often a very valuable report, because it allows you to see who you're doing the most activity with on a year-to-date basis. You also have, in this smart list, you could also pull in last year data that's also affected on your timing of when you close the year. All right, so I'm going to pause for just a moment. And Rebecca, do we have any questions related to receivables?
Someone asked, can you put New Year cash receipts in before you close out the previous calendar year?
That will actually affect the activity if you post them. It'll affect the numbers of cash received year to date and so forth. So typically, that's why we suggest, if you can, to go ahead and close the year right away. And it's easier in receivables because receivables is just really based upon your invoicing, which you control, versus when you get paid by, or when you pay vendors, or when you get their invoices. Sometimes there's some date sensitivity issues to that. So if you post those cash receipts for the new year prior to closing, then those numbers the year-to-date numbers will be off based upon those numbers. Any others, Rebecca?
I have a couple people asking about the webinar being available after, and yes, it will be. We'll be recording it, and it will be posted on our website after.
And Rebecca, we're also going to provide the deck, aren't we?
Yes. So besides that, you're good to continue on, Jeff.
Okay, thank you. All right, so what I wanted to cover next was payables. And so in payables management, you're going to look at this and say, well, it's a lot like receivables, but there are some differences. So on payables management, the calendar year close routine should be run, just like we talked about in receivables, should be run at the end of the calendar year prior to posting transactions in the next calendar year. And the fiscal year end close routine should be run at the end of the fiscal year prior to posting transactions in the next fiscal year. And we face the same timing issues as we did in receivables. So the checklist looks something like this. We post all the transactions for the year, and then some of these are recommended, like printing an age trial balance prior to running the year end is really something you should do. So you want to print your age trial balance with options report. And while it's not required, you should probably consider running the vendor period analysis report as well. Now, the next item on this list might throw you for a loop. So notice that on this list, there's install the payroll year-end update, and it's optional. But I don't know if any of you on the line are using payroll, but the year-end update is typically available to prepare payroll for the closing of the year. That might be a change in the format of the W-2. It could be a variety of different things that help you prepare for that. But that year-end update is also really more of a service pack, so to speak. And so there have been times where in that year-end update, there's also an update to the 1099 form as an example. And so I think it would be wise to at least understand what's in the year-end update before running your close. So that's what I would suggest. There is a document that will tell you all the features that are added in the payroll year-end update so that you know. Then obviously you want to make a backup that is named your pre-1099 edits. And then you want to verify the 1099 information and edit if it's required. I'm going to show you some screens for that. Print your 1099 statements. And I'm going to tell you this really doesn't have to go in this order. So, and then you'll make a backup that is named pre-year end. Close your year. Again, close your fiscal periods. And then if you're working with payables and receivables, then you would, after you're done with both, then you'd close the tax year, if applicable. And then you can make a backup after you've closed your year. So the reason I say you don't have to print your 1099s prior to running your year end is because that functionality is actually date sensitive, and you'll see that in a minute. So in reality, you can close your year prior to printing your 1099s. So this probably looks somewhat familiar. although the page lands a little differently, which means the payables developers and the receivables developers weren't quite in sync. All you have to do is select appropriate year, whether you want to print a report, the system shows you the last time we've closed, and then you simply click close year, and that will allow you to close the year. So, and you can get to that using the purchasing, routines, year-end close process. Okay, so the same issue that we talked about before with date sensitivity, on the payable side, there are fields like amount billed year to date, amount or cash paid year to date, those kind of things. Those numbers are affected by your year-end process. And so if your timing is a little off, then you do have the ability to run that script that Microsoft will provide, but otherwise it might be off by 1 or 2 payments, 1 or 2 bills that you've received and posted, etc. So this is the field that is affected by the lack of date sensitivity. Now, a couple other things to keep in mind are on the payable side is you do have the ability to edit 1099 transaction information. So this actually allows me to take a particular transaction after the fact, and I can edit it to allow us to change the tax type, for instance, or the box, so that the numbers are accurate. So we do have some flexibility there, as well as being able to update 1099 information here. So this allows me to do things like do a bulk change. So if there is a set of vendors that I didn't set up as 1099, I wanted to, I could do that, etc. So I do have quite a bit of flexibility between those two windows to make sure that my 1099 information is correct prior to printing the 1099s. And then here is the window for printing 1099s. So what you'll see here is you do have the ability, well, first of all, you have your federal ID, you pick the year that you're going to produce the 1099s for, the type of 1099 you're producing. You have the ability to do this one at a time or all your vendors at once. You can determine how they're ordered. So this is the window that will allow you to actually produce the 1099s. Now, I don't have this in the slide deck, but if you need to produce these electronically, there are tools available that are not Dynamics GP products. For instance, there's a company called Green Shades that actually has an electronic submission tool to allow you to submit your 1099s via electronic means. And then this is the tax year-end close. So what you can see here is this actually allows you to go in and I apologize. Let me tell you how to get here. This is under Administration, Routines, and Tax Year-End. So I missed a heading there. But the idea would be that this allows you to close out your year for tax purposes. Now, this procedure you only do once a year, and you do it after you close the sales and purchasing series. And then what this does is when you close the tax year, the tax information from the prior year is deleted. Okay, so this would be a step that it kind of works in combo with payables and receivables closing. So with that, I'm going to pause again and see if there are any questions on payables.
Nope, nothing. Oh wait, something just came in. The form for printing the 1096 did not align last year. Is there an update needed to be able to use the 1096 feature? She's on GP 2015.
2015?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess I'm not aware that that was a problem, but I would suggest that we might want to check into that prior to getting to that point this year. So My email address is jsmith@socius1.com. If you wouldn't mind sending me an email, I will check into that and have somebody get back to you if that would be okay.
We have another question. How do you get 1099 updates if you are not a payroll user?
Well, that would be the year-end update that I was talking about. So if we go back to our original checklist, where I was talking about installing the payroll year-end update, if there's a change to 1099, it will happen in this payroll year-end update. I hope that answers your question.
And that is all the questions we have.
Okay, thank you. All right, so now we're going to move on to fixed assets. So for fixed assets, the process is fairly simple. What we're going to do here is, and this one's important because this does affect the order for which you're doing things, perform all the year-end closing procedures for payables management. And I don't know if many of you know this, but payables management can link to fixed assets, can create placeholder records in the fixed asset module. And so if there are payables transactions that include assets and you're using that integration between the two modules, then you would need to make sure this gets done after payables management. Also, you need to enter all the fixed asset transactions for the current fiscal year, depreciate all the assets through the last day of the current fiscal year, post all your transactions to the general ledger, and then run any year-end reports that you want to keep as part of your year-end financial package. Then you need to make sure that your fixed asset calendar is built correctly, that you verify that the quarters are set up correctly for all fiscal years. You create a backup, common theme backup, and then perform the fixed asset year-end closing routine. And that's what this looks like. So you can run all available books and close them all at one time, or you can do them one at a time. So this window you get to through financial, routines, fixed assets, and year-end. So that was short, so I'm going to go ahead and do analytical accounting, and then I'll pause again for some questions. So analytical accounting, for those of you who don't know, is a module that allows you to create what are called dimensions that can augment your chart of accounts so that when you're entering transactions, you can use it for things like tracking transactions against a grant or a project, or really whatever you'd like. And so analytical accounting is used by a number of our clients. And so this allows us to include analytical accounting in the year-end processing, even though it really doesn't have its own separate year-end process. It's more of a setting. So in analytical accounting, there is not a separate year-end close procedure. The balance brought forward entries are created for all analytical accounting dimensions automatically as part of the year-end close process if you have the analytical accounting dimensions set up to have a balance brought forward entry. So what we're talking about here is, do you include dimensions in your year-end close? That's really what this is all about. This setting is specifically, and it's a one-time setup, and then you'll see that we can set this for different dimension codes also. So this setting has to be checked, and then this is part of the year-end as well. So I have a dimension called grant, and this allows me to check box if I want to consolidate the balances during the year-end close. So in other words, carry forward a beginning balance. So with that in mind, we talked very quickly about fixed assets. It's a pretty easy process. We talked a little bit about analytical accounting, if any of you are using that. And I'm going to pause again for a second. And before we move on to the general ledger. We'll pause for a second to see if there are any more questions.
We do have one. What is the path to print out aged trial balance with options report for purchasing module?
So that would be use the purchase. You go to purchasing, and then you go to reports, and then you go to trial balance, and then there's a drop-down list, and aged trial balance with options is one of them.
Someone also asked, when do you set up the new fiscal year?
Typically, you can do that really at any time ahead of time, but certainly before you're going to try to post anything to that new year. You do have the ability to set it up ahead of time and then just close all the periods so you can't post to it to be safe. So I would say that ends up being a preference call, but it's not uncommon to see that done sometime, if you're on a calendar year, sometime in December, even before you are posting any transactions.
And we have nothing else, so you can keep going.
Okay, thanks. All right, so we're in the final stretch. So we're going to fit within our hour very easily. So the next thing is the general ledger. And so the general ledger is always the final module to be closed. And it's the one module that you really don't need to close it immediately like the others. So it has flexibility that the other modules really don't have. But it also is a bigger process than the others. So the checklist for this is you want to complete the posting procedures and the closing procedures for every other module. You want to post all of your final adjusting entries in the general ledger. And we all know that that isn't realistic. There are going to be audit adjustments and things like that that come later. We're going to talk about that. But you want to post everything that you can in the general ledger before you close. You also, and this may be a unique one for you, but you want to print an account list to verify the posting type of each account. And I'm going to show you a smart list where you can do that. You want to close the last period of your fiscal year. And then optionally, you can perform file maintenance on the financial series. That ends up being a preference. So you want to verify the settings in the general ledger setup window, and I'm going to show you that window. You want to make a backup, print a detailed trial balance report. Now that detailed trial balance report can be found under Financial, Reports, Trial Balance. And then making it a detailed report is a checkbox in the setup window for the report, so it can be summary or detail. You want to print your year-end financial statements, and we're going to talk about the ramifications of the year-end close for financial statements here in just a second as well. And so here you would set up the new fiscal year. You want to close the fiscal year. Now see, setting up the new fiscal year based on general ledger may not make sense for you because you may be not ready to close your year until several months down the road. And if that's the case, you don't necessarily want to not have those fiscal periods set up. Then you close your year, and then you close all the fiscal periods for the series. Okay, so ultimately then that's kind of the checklist. The other thing is adjust the budget figures for the new year and print the financial statements, and then make a backup. So let's talk about some of the things that you got to keep into consideration. So this is actually the window where you close the year. So to get to that, you go to Financial, Routines, Year-End Closing. Now, there are several things on this window, but a couple things I wanted to point out was this blank area here. You're thinking, why do you have that? Why do you have that marked? Well, this, when you start actually closing the year, when you click the Close Year button, this becomes your progress bar. Okay, And so older versions of GP didn't have this progress bar. People got worried, thought their system wasn't working because it would stall out, and they would actually reboot, which is a big no-no. So you just want to follow your progress bar, make sure that you know where you're at. A new feature is this one. You can actually reverse a historical year. So you have the ability to open a year that you've closed. So that might be something that comes in play, but we're going to talk about options around that as well. So this is your retained earnings account, and I'm going to show you the window where you set that up, and that can be one single retained earnings account, or it can be broken down into what's called a divisional retained earnings account. And then the system will just provide for everything moving forward, just the next journal entry number. So really a pretty simple window. You do have the ability to maintain inactive accounts that have budget amount or all inactive accounts. You can do these things as well. So there are some maintenance ideas that are available, but in reality, this is really the most important area right here. So I wanted to spend a minute talking about the general ledger setup windows. This is where, and this is under financial setup general ledger. So this is where, right way back in the beginning, this is where you're going to set up your general ledger. This is where you determine whether you've got a single retained earnings account or you're going to close to divisional accounts. This is an area where you're determining whether you're going to maintain history or not. So what happens is that when you close your year, the information moves from an open year table or file to a historical file. And are you maintaining that history? And then the other thing is that relates back to what we were just talking about. Do we allow posting the history? So I wanted to talk for a second. When you close your year, what happens is that it rolls forward your beginning balances and it zeroes all of your P&L accounts to retained earnings. That's why you define what your retained earnings account is, and that's why you got to make sure your accounts are set up right in your chart of accounts, which I'll show you in a minute. So these are some decisions you need to make sure that this ends up with what you were expecting. Now, this is the smart list I was telling you about. So what this is this is a smart list of just your chart of accounts. So you can see here that I just went into smart list, I selected accounts, and I did the generic one, and this is it. So here you have your accounts, your description, and then your posting type and your category. So if you open up this smart list and you see a cash account that says profit and loss, that's a red flag, because all of your balance sheet accounts roll forward with a beginning balance. All of your P&L accounts close to zero and go to retained earnings. So if your cash account's not set up properly, then it's going to close like a P&L account instead of like a balance sheet account. So things to keep in mind. This is a nice little easy way to just make sure that everything's set up properly. So that I think that's something you want to make sure. So again, with general ledger, it can take a little longer. It's going to depend on your transaction volume, because it is actually taking all of your data that might be in an open year table and moving it to a historical table. So unlike your receivables and payables and inventory that are just updating summary numbers, this is actually doing a file transaction. And so depending on your volume, your infrastructure, etc., can determine how long it takes. In many cases, it's not a long process either, but you just got to be aware that this is a little bit more of a process-intensive year-end close. All right. So with that, I'm going to let Rebecca tell you about a few things, and then we'll field any questions you may have.
Thanks, Jeff. Just a couple of additional items we wanted to mention before we start the Q&A. All upcoming events can be found on our website at socius1.com. Our next GP webinar, From Data to Dashboards, Power BI's Best Practices, is on December 13th from 11 to 12 Eastern. And then you can feel free to reach out to Jeff if you have any questions. His contact information is on the next screen, Jeff, if you don't mind going to the next one. And you can contact him there. And then we'll go ahead and start the Q&A. Jeff, we do have a couple of questions that were typed out.
Okay.
The first one is the final detailed TB to be run by company or by entity? Within our company, we have over 300 entities.
So you have a single company database with 300 entities. And was that PB that I heard?
T as in Tom, TB.
So ask the question one more time. So I was processing in the wrong order there. One more time.
Is the final detailed TB to be run by company or by entity? Within our company, we have over 300 entities.
Well, I think that ends up being a preference, but in general, you would want to do it overall because you know that year-end process is going to happen for all the entities at the same time. So I would say that you really need a comprehensive trial balance.
Okay, our next question is, if I don't check maintain inactive accounts, will GP delete them? What will happen?
It can, yes, that's right. Now, there are some issues, and I apologize, I need to double check this, but you know, removing accounts sometimes depends on if there's historical data in them and so forth. So I will double check that to make sure how that affects that situation as well. I apologize, I wasn't quite prepared for that. But if it's inactive account with no activity in it, it definitely removes it.
Okay, so that's all the questions we have. Oh, one just popped up. If we don't integrate our FA module into GL, does that change my close process?
I would assume then what you're doing is you're just integrating a journal entry. So it certainly does, because then the fixed asset module isn't a part of your close process. Other than there probably is some sort of process that you need to follow in whatever other tool you're using to manage your fixed assets. So if you're using, as an example, a number of our clients are using Sage FAS, I think is what it's called. So if there's a year-end process in Sage FAS, you'd want to follow that. But in reality, if we're talking specifically about your GP close, then there would be no fixed asset close.
And she did clarify that they use the GPFA module. They just don't integrate.
Oh, so they just don't post it to the general ledger. Well, you still need to do the close then, other than the post to general ledger. And the reason I say that is because you still want to be able to track all your year-to-date information.
Okay. So those are all the questions we have right now. We'll go ahead and stay on the line for a couple more minutes, but I do want to thank everyone for joining the webinar and taking time out of your day. If you have any questions, again, feel free to raise your hand or type the question in the question box.